on 9/11, the United States lost almost 3,000 people, and we quickly invaded two countries, and then got militarily involved in country after country, basically upset the entire world in response. But the Soviet loss in World War II is the equivalent of one 9/11 a day, every day for 24 years. One a day for 24 years. And so, as President Kennedy said in his American University...
How many hundreds of Giulianis would be created by that? I mean, that would be a nightmare.
Kennedy says in his commencement address at American University in '63 that what the Soviets suffered was the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago being destroyed. So we have to understand, put this in some context, what the Soviets suffered in World War II, which is why the way the United States treated them after the war is so outrageous, and
still today.
So unforgivable.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal, still in quarantine in Washington, D.C. And this past week was the 75th anniversary of Nazi Germany's surrender in World War II, an absolutely historic, monumental occasion. And the way the White House commemorated this was very interesting. The White House published a tweet praising the U.S. and Britain without mentioning another key country that not only was involved in defeating Nazi Germany, but actually did the vast majority of the heavy lifting, in fact, killing 80% of the Nazi soldiers who died in World War II. I'm, of course, talking about the Soviet Union. So joining us to discuss this topic today is a leading historian on not just World War II and U.S. Politics, but also one of the leading historians specifically of U.S. nuclear policy, nuclear weapons, and specifically the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Peter Kuznick is a professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C., and he has published and co-edited a variety of books, but he's also most known for working for several years with the Academy Award-winning filmmaker Oliver Stone on an excellent book and documentary series, The Untold History of the United States. And you can find that, well, I guess it used to be on Netflix. I don't know if it is. Peter, where can people see that documentary series now? And also, you were just saying that you published a new chapter of The Untold History of the United States.
Well, the documentary series is available on Netflix. And just last year, Oliver and I came out with the new edition of the big book. So now it's more than 900 pages. We added a 160 plus page chapter on the second term of the Obama presidency and the first few years of the Trump presidency. So in many countries, that's being published as a standalone book by itself. But in the United States, in English, it's part of the big overall history of the American empire and national security state. Plus, we just also came out recently with volume 2 of the Young Reader's Book, and our graphic novel is getting closer by the day. So pretty soon we're going to have the graphic novel out also.
Excellent. Well, we had been really disturbed by a lot of the mainstream coverage of VE Day, the 75th anniversary of the Allies' victory. And obviously the Trump administration is a little bit more inclined to sort of nakedly abuse history and excise the Soviet or Russian contribution. But, there's been this mainstreaming of what I guess could be described as the double genocide narrative, which is that, Stalin and Hitler were essentially moral equals who both contributed to a genocide, and through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, essentially were both equally responsible for starting World War II. And that beyond that, most Americans, through our popular culture, understand World War II as basically the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, with the greatest generation storming the beach at Normandy. And they believe that it was essentially D-Day, thanks to so much conditioning through Hollywood, that really won the war. They don't know about they really don't know about the real battles that turned the tide of the war, like the Battle of Kursk, for example, which was the first time in World War II that the German Wehrmacht failed to penetrate the strategic depth of their enemy during an offensive. And that was, a battle won by the Soviet Union, working with British intelligence, but won by the Soviet Union while they were fighting on several other fronts after fending off the German encirclement of Stalingrad. So there's this whole history. Actually, I started, when I was getting upset with this abuse of history last week, I started, looking for documentaries, American documentaries about the Soviet contribution. And I had to go back to the early 70s, and I found this documentary series featuring Burt Lancaster, who's actually one of my favorite lefty Hollywood actors, that was made in conjunction with Soviet film crews and Soviet archivists and historians. I think it was called, the Hidden War, because the war had been hidden from most Americans, about the central role that the Soviet Union played. So there's a lot to talk about here, a lot to unpack, including, the observances of the war in former, Warsaw Pact countries, and the battle over history that's taking place there. But Peter, what was your response to the official and semi-official observances of VE Day, particularly here in the United States and in Washington, where we both live?
Max, you open up a lot of different ways we can go with this conversation today. But in terms of the last question, rather than going back to the history that you were talking about, you mentioned this tweet from Trump in the White House, claiming basically that the United States and Britain won the war, leaving out the Soviet contribution completely. Trump's ignorance of, and I did a lot of interviews on this, especially with Russian outlets, and they all want to know, is Trump deliberately lying and falsifying history? What's behind this? And my response was that Trump is so ignorant, Trump is so, on some level, stupid, that he might not even realize how wrongheaded his tweet is. We're dealing with a whole other level of stupidity and ignorance. Somebody who doesn't read, doesn't know any history, and says the most stupid things. But the upsetting thing about it is that Trump is not alone. When you talk to the students about World War II, many of them think that we were fighting against the Soviet Union. They don't even know that the US and the Soviets were on the same side in World War II. We got that kind of ignorance on so many issues. One of my friends who teaches history at the University of Minnesota said that in a class of 35 students, almost all of them thought the United States had won the Vietnam War. So this is not just a problem that we have in Washington or in the White House. This level of ignorance is ubiquitous. Back in 2007, I remember reading the National Report Card, and the area in which American high school seniors came in lowest was not math or science, which Americans are notoriously bad at. It was U.S. history. That only 12% of Americans were judged to be proficient in their understanding of U.S. history. though only 2% could say what the Brown versus Board of Education decision was about, even though it was obvious from the way that the question was worded. So we have a real problem in the United States, from the elementary school up to the buffoon in the White House. The reality of World War II, as Max was suggesting, is, of course, very, very different. The commemoration, and is commemorated differently, and is remembered differently, and understood differently in all of these different countries. In Europe, well, back in a few years ago, they did a survey asking Europeans who deserves the principal credit for winning World War II. 17% of Europeans across the continent said that I gave the Soviets credit for winning World War II. In countries like France, it was down to 7% who credited the Soviets. The overwhelming majority credited the United States with being the dominant force. In Britain, they credited the British with being the dominant force in winning World War II. So we're dealing with an appalling level of historical ignorance, and we can't draw the right lessons from this. The lessons that these countries are drawing just reinforce the current new Cold War against China, the ongoing Cold War against Russia, that kind of narrative that's so dangerous and so pervasive.
And Peter, can you talk about the Soviets' role? I mean, many of our listeners are probably familiar with this, but in your series, in your book and in the documentary series, The Untold History of the United States, you point out, for instance, that the Soviet Union, the Soviet Red Army, was fighting around 200 German units, whereas the US and the UK combined were only fighting around 10 Nazi units, and 80% of Nazi casualties in World War II were on the Eastern Front, not on the Western Front.
Yes. Max mentioned the different narratives, and that the American narrative, it really starts with Pearl Harbor. You know, we get hit at Pearl Harbor, and then we go to declare war. But it doesn't get going right away. So and then they mentioned that in 1943, we got involved in North Africa and in the Mediterranean. We don't really explain what that was about. And then we jump to D-Day, June 6, 1944, and that's when the real war begins. Then the Americans heroically take the beaches at Normandy and fight back against this fierce German resistance there. And then the Americans move steadily into Germany and win the war in May of 1945. The Russian narrative is very, very different. The Russian narrative begins June 22nd, 1941, not December 7th, 1941, and when the Germans attack and invade Russia. Then the Russians heroically push the Germans back in the Battle of Moscow, and then the Russians single-handedly are fighting against the German invaders. And as Max said, then there's the huge victory in Stalingrad, followed by the great tank battle at Kursk and the defeat of the siege of Leningrad, where people heroically resisted and fought and eating wallpaper and just starving to death, but resisted. And then the Germans, having put the Nazis back on the run, then the Germans follow them and take Berlin on May 9th of 1945. So you've got very, very different narratives about this. What people don't remember, there's a lot that they don't remember, but among the things they don't remember is that Stalin made several requests of the United States and the British as soon as the Germans invaded Russia.
And actually before, Peter, because another key historical detail that's often left out, even before the non-aggression pact, the Soviet Union offered the British and the French to have a joint invasion with 2 million soldiers to destroy Nazi Germany even before World War II began. And according to this now declassified historical government documentation, the British and the French both denied the Soviet offer and were not at all prepared. But the Soviets were prepared for a war, and the British and the French were not, because, of course, the reality is that they wanted the Germans to go east and to attack the Soviet Union.
I'd say it's a little more complicated than that, but I'd even started further back. I think that where things really went wrong was in the Spanish Civil War. And now you've got not only Franco's fascist forces being supported militarily by Germany and Italy, and the only country that was providing support in any significant way to the Spanish Republic was the Soviet Union. And that was the chance to stop the spread of fascism even earlier on in 1936. The United States declared what Roosevelt later called as dumb neutrality. Now, again, history is more complicated always. The Americans were so resistant to getting involved in another European war because they saw the absurdity of the First World War. In the First World War, a war more than anything else to defend the Allied colonies, to make the world safe for colonialism, not to make the world safe for democracy. And the United States goes into the war on the side of the British and French. In large part, Americans believed and understood because of Morgan's banking ties, especially to Britain. And so the British owed us vast amounts of money, and the Germans and their allies owed us very little money. But the narrative that was developing in the 1930s was about the futility and the waste of World War I. And so if you look at the post-war movies and literature, American culture saw the waste of the war. And there were even hearings in 1934, Senate hearings, talking about, in the event of another war, we have to nationalize the war industry, basically. We don't want the profiteers to drive us into war the way the profiteer drove us into war in World War I. So there was a strong anti-war sentiment in the United States in the 1930s, which on some level is healthy, but in this specific context, it turned out to be unfortunate because it delayed American entry into the war and allowed us to adopt this neutrality policy in terms of the Spanish Civil War, which was really our opportunity to stop Hitler and Mussolini. Having blown that opportunity, what the Soviets were trying to do with the Popular Front period, when they made the shift from the Third period into the Popular Front, from the Revolutionary period into a more friendly period when they reached out to the Western democracies, the Western capitalist countries, and asked for an alliance against fascism. Hitler had made it clear in Mein Kampf what his strategy was, and that was to move east and take over Ukraine, take over the Soviet Union, and that's the Lebensraum he wanted. That was the land he wanted to expand into. So it was very, very clear, on top of the anti-Semitism that he was driven by. And so Stalin understood that. He knew what Hitler's intentions were. And the Western leaders, as you say, knew that also. There were many people in the West who were not opposed to Hitler. We've done a lot of studies, a lot written, some good, some bad, about the American business ties to the Nazis. And one of my most recent PhD students has done a terrific study on this, Jason Weichselbaum. But American business was in bed with the Nazis. Ford, GM were producing a lot of the war material that the Nazis needed in order to carry out their policy of conquest that they were carrying out. And Henry Ford was notorious in that regard. Prescott Bush was very much involved. The Trading with the Enemy Act and his ties to, Union Bank or Union Corporation, but there was a lot of ties of American businessmen. Hitler had a photo of Henry Ford on his wall in his office. He said, Heinrich Ford is my hero. So there was a lot of that going on at the time. So we had opportunities. Now the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, when the Russians look at the war and they study the war now, they don't start it with that. They don't start, because that's not a part of the glorious narrative that the Russians want to extol right now. So they downplay that, and they begin the war later. One of the things that's important to remember is that Stalin didn't really use the time as productively as he could have between 1931 and 1939 and 41 to get ready for the German invasion. He was being warned by the West that Germany was about to invade, and he disbelieved that. He thought it was disinformation from the West. And when the Germans invaded, the Russians were really caught with their pants down. And Stalin goes into this depression and disappears for a while. And in the beginning, the Americans and the British feared that the Soviets were going to collapse, that they were going to capitulate rather than stand up to the Germans. But Stalin made clear very quickly, said, if you give us the material that we need, you give us the aluminum, the airplanes, and some of the other material that we need, we're going to stand up to the Germans and hold them off and be able to resist them. There was a lot of very deep skepticism, especially on the part of the British, that the Soviets could do that. But they did, and they repulsed the Germans at Moscow. And it wasn't just the cold winter. In fact, Stalin performed actually very, very well once he got his bearings again, rallying the troops, giving lots of speeches, and rallying the resistance to the German onslaught. And that was the first case in which the Germans were repulsed. So, but there's the history of this, again, Stalin had reason to believe that the West was encouraging Hitler to move east against the Soviet Union. And for a lot of reasons, including the fact, as you're saying, that Britain and France refused to align with Russia to stop Hitler from his expansion eastward.
Can you talk a little? I mean, I guess let's keep going with the history of the war and some of the less well-known components in the West. Can you talk a little bit about Operation?
1 second.
Yeah.
And just because what we were talking about, Ben mentioned that the Americans and the Brits were confronting 10 German divisions throughout most of the war, while the Soviets were confronting 200 German divisions. And that even Churchill said it was the Red Army that tore the guts out of the German war machine. This was widely recognized at the time. What people don't recognize is what that Soviet resistance looked like and required on such a massive scale of relocating industry. I mean, they basically picked up the entire industrial infrastructure and rebuilt it.
They had to move it to the other side of the Ural Mountains, am I right?
Yes.
And I mean, the amount of human sacrifice that required
was unbelievable. But that was the point I wanted to make, is that I did a survey, an anonymous survey with college students. These were all A students in high school. They supposedly knew some history. Anonymous survey, asked them, how many Americans died in World War II? The median answer I got was 90,000.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so they were only 300,000 off.
Yeah.
I asked them, how many Soviets died in World War II?
26 million.
The median answer I got was 100,000.
Oh, my God.
They were only 27 million off. 27 million off. They learned nothing about World War II. They know nothing. They can't understand the Cold War. They can't. They don't know what Ukraine is about now. So, I mean, this is the level of historical ignorance that I was saying. And so, in order to make them understand what 27 million means, I explained to them that on 9/11, which is before many of them were born now, on 9/11, the United States lost almost 3,000 people, and we quickly invaded 2 countries, and then got militarily involved in country after country, basically upset the entire world in response. But the Soviet loss in World War II is the equivalent of one 9/11 a day every day for 24 years. One a day for 24 years. And so, as President Kennedy said in his American University...
How many hundreds of Giulianis would be created by that? I mean, that would be a nightmare.
Kennedy says in his commencement address at American University in 1963 that what the Soviets suffered was the equivalent of the entire United States east of Chicago being destroyed. So we have to understand, put this in some context, what the Soviets suffered in World War II, which is why the way the United States treated them after the war is so outrageous, and
still today.
So unforgivable. We can get into that later.
Well, you mentioned, the relocation of Soviet industry under the watch of Stalin to east of the Ural mountain range in order to prevent it from being destroyed by Nazi Germany, which required not only massive human sacrifice and even level of brutality, but also foresight on the part of Stalin, who realized that he faced this massive threat to his West. And we saw what happened in Ukraine in 1941. I mean, this is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. This is where it got its coal from, and it was taken over by Nazi Germany for, I think, 2 years, for 3 years. So the stakes were high, but maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the forgotten battles. Operation Barbarossa, for example, was, I think, the bloodiest campaign in World War II, and Americans know very little about this. And also the role of the partisans and the role of the Soviet Union in supporting the partisans. There were 200,000 Jewish partisans who participated in this campaign of sabotage to attack Nazi Germany in areas it occupied.
And Yugoslav partisans.
Yes.
Everywhere. In Ukraine, it was a very, very important element, and they were fighting against a lot of Ukrainian fascists who, we know that history of...
Wait, Peter, the State Department says those are anti-Russian freedom fighters.
I know, and Ronald Reagan said that the Contras in Nicaragua were freedom fighters too. So we've got a lot of freedom fighters who are murderers and rapists and Nazi sympathizers.
Well, they're fighting freedom, so maybe there's some truth in it.
But in terms of, Max, what you were saying, I wanted to read to you a comment by New York Times correspondent Ralph Parker in April of 1942, early on in the war. And he said that, he talked about how completely the Russian people have adapted themselves to war conditions. He says the whole people are caught up with an enthusiastic passion to be doing something constructive for the common task. He proclaims it would need a Tolstoy to describe the heroic endurance of the men and women who have made these things possible. That's another thing that we forget was the attitude toward the Russians during World War II and to the Soviets more broadly. The Orville Prescott, who was the main book reviewer for the New York Times, wrote in 1942, he says, the vast armaments, the fighting skill, magnificent courage of the Red Army may prove to have been the decisive factors in the salvation of the human race from Nazi slavery. Our debt of gratitude to the millions of Russian soldiers who have fought and died in this war, and who will continue to do so, is beyond estimation or expression. MacArthur credits the Soviets with one of the greatest military feats in all of human history. This was widely known and appreciated during the time.
Well, Stalin was known as Uncle Joe, right?
Yeah, Stalin was Uncle Joe. And when it was at Tehran, when Roosevelt met with Stalin there and was getting nowhere the first time he met with him, and he says to Churchill, you're not going to like this, but play along with me. And then Roosevelt going out of his way to stay at the Soviet compound and to befriend Stalin, and he was getting nowhere. And then he turns to Stalin and starts to make fun of the British finally at this meeting. And and then he and Stalin start chumming it up, and that's when he first calls him Uncle Joe. And he said, if I had done it before, he would have thought me rude, but now we laugh together. We're like friends and men and brothers. So yeah, Uncle Joe was the image. But you remember the wartime movies? Hollywood mobilized movies like Days of Glory and Mission to Moscow and Tender Comrades and Song of Russia and the North Star. I mean, there are a lot of Hollywood movies that were having this heroic image. The only one that would be considered really pro-Soviet government propaganda was probably Mission to Moscow, which was based upon Joseph Davies' memoirs. Joseph Davies had been a conservative Wall Street lawyer who Roosevelt chose to be ambassador to the Soviet Union, and the liberals were really upset. They thought he'd be virulently anti-Soviet, and he turned out to be very, very sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And in fact, so that movie was sort of a whitewash of the Purge trials. The others are more celebrating the heroic resistance of the Russian people, singing and dancing. You've got Ginger Rogers in one of them, Gregory Peck, so even Robert Taylor, who's later one of the more vicious red baiters during the WWII hearings and afterwards. Even he's in one of these, which he later apologizes for making. But when the McCarthyites targeted Hollywood, the first real target during the McCarthy hearings, or the pre-McCarthy hearings, the WWII hearings of 47, it was partly because they had made these progressive films to support the war effort in which they extolled the virtues of the heroic Russian resistance.
Well, it was important that we had a investigation led by the FBI into that Russian collusion. This is something that every liberal American member of the resistance should support. I mean, we can't allow Russian collusion. And there's the I'm being sarcastic, of course, but there's the famous image of Woody Guthrie with his guitar, which reads, "This machine kills fascists." He wasn't at some, punk rock show in the Bowery. He was actually on a tour to raise money for the Allied effort. And I think it was the Communist Party USA, which had sent him on that tour. So,
I mean, American culture was very pro-Soviet during this period. So the United States promised, okay, let me mention another piece of this that I started to get to. So in May of 1942, Roosevelt asked Stalin to send over Foreign Minister Molotov and a trusted general to Washington. Because the Soviets were confronting almost the entirety of the German army, the Americans knew that the only way to have an early impact in the war was to open up a second front in Western Europe. At that meeting with Molotov in late May 42, Roosevelt turns to General Marshall and says, "Are we ready to promise to open up the second front before the end of 1942? And Marshall assures him that the U.S. was. That was exactly what these Soviet leaders and the Soviet people were desperate to hear. That we were going to open up the second front in Western Europe sooner rather than later. And the U.S. correspondents in Moscow, Leland Stowe and others, said if any reason the Americans don't deliver on this, it will deal a crushing blow to the hopes and morale of the Russian people. And Roosevelt fully wanted to do that. However, Churchill blocked it. Churchill said, we're not ready, we don't have enough transports, we can't pull it off. Initially, Churchill had agreed to do that, but now Churchill backs off. And so instead, the United States gets involved in North Africa, Operation Torch. But Marshall and Eisenhower were furious. Marshall denounced what he called periphery pecking in Northern Africa to support basically British imperial interests, and says we should change our policy and our priorities and go after the Japanese first and let the British stew in their own juices, basically. Eisenhower, who led the campaign in North Africa, said when the U.S. gets involved in North Africa, that will be the blackest day in American history. They knew what the reality was. The British were afraid to take on. It's interesting now that the British all think that Britain deserves the lion's share of credit for having defeated the Nazis. The British were terrified of confronting the Germans on land during that time. The British were more concerned about shoring up their imperial interests in the Mediterranean, Egypt, in India. So as Churchill said, I'm not going to be the minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. And so their priorities are very different. Roosevelt during the war repeatedly denounced British and French and other European colonialism. He says we're never going to let the French back into Indochina after the war. He talks about what the British have been doing in Zambia and other places. Roosevelt said that if our allies had not treated the Asian colonies as terribly as they did, then we wouldn't be fighting in Asia. So I mean, there's a lot of other story involved to what's going on. But it was because the United States failed to open up the second front in 1942 that the Soviets were able to defeat the Germans militarily, almost single-handedly, and go on the offensive. Part of the reason why the Soviets were able to take, the irony, of course, Soviets were able to take Eastern Europe after the war was because the United States and the British had delayed in opening up the second front, which means that the Soviets, at Yalta, the Soviets got nothing that they didn't already occupy. Is the myth of Yalta, how Roosevelt sold out the Europeans to the Soviet Union. That's not what happened there. What happened was that we sold out the Soviets earlier, didn't open up the second front when we should have, and the Soviets had then been able to take all of that and pushing the Nazis back to Berlin. But the American people were very angry about this too. There were second front rallies all over the country during that period, 1942, 1943. The Americans were ready to go to war, as were the American military leaders, as was Roosevelt. But he felt he had to get the United States involved somewhere in 1943, and he didn't have an option, he believed, other than going along with the British plans at that point.
This history is really interesting, Peter, because you were talking about how there was so much anti-war sentiment at the beginning of World War II inside the United States. And one of the most interesting historical episodes for me in regard to this is Dalton Trumbo, who would later go on to be blacklisted and accused of being a communist. But Dalton Trumbo wrote the archetypal anti-war book, Johnny Got His Gun. And I mean, it's an incredible book about this World War I vet who wakes up one day and finds that he has his arms and legs amputated and doesn't have a tongue and he can't speak and he's trapped in his body and is essentially paralyzed and is going to die in this horrific state. But Dalton Trumbo intentionally repressed the publication of his own book because the line switched and they no longer opposed a war. They decided that it was a progressive anti-fascist war. So that to me is so interesting because, you as someone who was involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam and other subsequent wars, Max and I as journalists who are anti-war, it's really interesting to see that some of these figures who had been warning about the dangers of war after the mass inter-imperialist slaughter of World War I for nothing, some of them even repressed their own anti-war work, as in the case of Dalton Trumbo, in support of World War II. That's incredible, and that history is almost never discussed.
No, that's such a powerful novel. Great book. Well, that's why that history gets so murky, because the Communist Party in the United States, which had been in the forefront of the anti-war movement, has got to switch its line, turn it upside down overnight when the Soviets signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact in, I think it was April 23rd, 1939, or August 23rd, 1939. yeah, that was stunning. And the problem was, instead of honestly saying why they did this, they basically covered it up, and then they stopped criticizing Stalin, Hitler, and they stopped criticizing the Nazis, and whereas they were totally correct in what they were saying about them earlier, but they opportunistically took this other line, and so it just complicates the history of the war. I mean, there are other things that complicate the history of the war. Stalin's role. Okay, there's a lot to be said about that. I've taken students to Moscow to commemorate Victory Day in 2017, 2018, and 2019. The International Association of Peace Foundations has gotten grants and pay for my students to go over there. They cover the expenses. I was able to bring 13 students in 2017, 20 in 2018, and 6 in 2019. And for the Victory Day commemorations there. And but even there, they're presenting a certain view of World War II that conforms to the messages that the Putin administration wants to convey. In the earlier Victory Days celebrations, they were not military parades. This is a much more recent addition to them. Now you've got this mighty show of force, and then you've got the immortal regiment that we participate in, not in the military parade for obvious reasons, but it's being used in a nationalistic way by the Russian government to build up a certain narrative about Russian heroism. And I'm fine with celebrating victory over fascism. I'm happy to do that in any way, in any form, in any country. But history gets instrumentalized. In the United States, it's used, as you know, for often very malign and deceptive purposes. Japan is another notorious case. Shinzo Abe is one of the worst historical falsifiers on the planet. And for the time he came into the parliament, that was his goal. And since he's been back in power again, from the very beginning, he's been whitewashing history, sanitizing history, especially the history of World War II. It's interesting how central the history of World War II is in so many countries' narratives and sense of self-identity. But Japan has been doing this for terrible purposes and to terrible ends, whitewashing the slaughters in China. Now, most historians assume that about 12 million Chinese died at Japanese hands with the invasion beginning in Manchuria in 31, then the big invasion in 37 with the rape of Nanjing and the horrible things that were going on. So most historians accept that figure of about 12 million. The Chinese Communist Party claims that 35 million Chinese died at Japanese hands. And nobody's quite able to verify that. But we're talking about vast numbers of people. We're talking about the political uses of history in ways that are very dangerous and very, very destructive.
We've seen Abe visit as recently as last year the Yasukuni Shrine, which is a shrine to the war criminals who carried out that slaughter in China.
Yeah, they've been doing that. They use this as part of their campaign against Article 9. I mean, one of the good things the Americans did after the war was actually impose a peace constitution in Japan. MacArthur, for some reason, we can explain that, but was behind doing this. The American and when Article 9 says that the Japanese renounce the right of war and the right to have offensive military forces. When the U.S. got involved in the Korean War in 1950, we put a tremendous amount of pressure on Japan to do away with Article 9 so they could help us militarily. But the Japanese resisted. The Japanese people are even resisting Abe's attempts, at least legally, to do that, although Abe has certainly done a lot to achieve that without getting rid of Article 9, to become a quote-unquote normal country. But this militarism is rampant across the planet right now, and so countries celebrate the victory in World War II for the wrong reasons, in the wrong ways, often.
maybe we could talk a little bit about the geopolitics or the geopolitical forces that are motivating the weaponization of narratives around World War II. With Japan, I've been reading some of the, policy papers being put forward by some of the China hawks in Biden's camp, who really want to take the Obama pivot to Asia, which aimed to basically encircle China with naval battalions, nuclear weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and really reorient U.S. Forward positions, military forward positions, to the great power competition against China. And a lot of them talk about, not just shredding Article 9, but turning Japan into, this forward operating U.S. proxy against China, which it kind of already is, as well as South Korea, despite whatever resistance they might find there politically from the South Korean population. Obviously, the Trump administration is completely on board with what they call great power competition against China. And U.S. Forces are being repositioned from the Middle East to Eastern Europe. So many soldiers that have been serving in Afghanistan or Iraq are now being moved into NATO positions to encircle Russia. So we saw last week a joint statement issued by the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, someone who you can't say is illiterate. He's a former West Point officer. I think he went to Harvard. He might be stupid, but you can't say he's illiterate or uneducated. He might be he's more like kind of like a real life living embodiment of the warlord Jabba the Hutt or something. But in any case, he issued this really despicable statement alongside the foreign ministers of the countries that Donald Rumsfeld, Bush's defense secretary, called New Europe, which were, the former Warsaw Pact Soviet satellite states, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Slovakia, these countries, which only mentioned Nazi Germany once, and was just this gigantic anti-communist rant. And this necessitated an angry statement from none other than the German foreign minister, who declared that the repeated attempt in recent months to rewrite history so disgracefully requires us to speak up loud and clear, something that should not actually be necessary in view of the irrefutable historical facts, and to leave no doubt whatsoever that Germany alone unleashed the Second World War by its invasion of Poland and Germany alone, and is responsible for the crimes against humanity of the Holocaust. Those who sow doubt about this and thrust other countries into the role of perpetrator do injustice to the victims, exploit history for their own ends, and divide Europe. I never, thought in my lifetime that I would see the United States sort of officially edge towards Holocaust revisionism. But that seems to be what's happening here. And I wonder, if either of you have any thoughts on how we got here at this point. Is this really motivated by great power competition with Russia and China as a single kind of, as a single counter-hegemonic bloc to U.S. empire?
Well, I've been also doing interviews about U.S. and China quite a bit. And, it's very, very alarming that we're so much down the road to a new Cold War with China. Americans, the United States needs an enemy. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, one of the leading Soviet analysts said, we're going to do the worst thing possible to you. We're going to leave you without an enemy. that didn't last long, right? We quickly found new enemies, and we're soon invading. Well, first there was Panama, and then there was the first Gulf War, and then it didn't take us long once the Soviet
Yugoslavia
Union collapsed. We have plenty of enemies always, but the big enemies, even Iraq's not a big enemy, even Iran is not a worthy enemy, but China and Russia really are. And we are, it's very sad that we're repeating a lot of that history. The Asia pivot policy, as you suggest, is basically a containment policy, basically the policy that George Kennan laid out for how to deal with and defeat the Soviet Union is the policy we now have toward China. I'm very involved with Okinawa. I'm supposed to go there again, and very soon, if possible. And the anti-base movement there is partly motivated by environmental concerns and by local concerns, but they also understand that the U.S. military presence on Okinawa is essential for U.S. strategy for fighting against China. It's Okinawa from which the troops have gone out for every American war, whether it's Vietnam, if Iraq, Afghanistan. A few years ago, one of my trips to Okinawa, I met with Al McElby, who was the highest U.S. official, the consul general there. And we asked him, why is Okinawa so essential? And he said, because of the location, the location strategically in relation to China and to North Korea. So even though the people of Okinawa time and time again have risen up to demand that the U.S. remove the military presence, not relocate the base from Futenma to Hinoko and destroy the Ora Bay, this beautiful, pristine area, the United States refuses. It was that issue, really, that to Obama's shame, when Prime Minister Hatoyama stood up in defense of the people of Okinawa, Obama came down and destroyed him. He smashed him. That was basically the end of the JDP. We went back to the reactionary LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the party of Abe and his grandfather, war criminal Kishi, and Sato, his uncle, or his father, his uncle. So, there's a lot of history to all of this, but this new Cold War strategy toward China is really so dangerous again. So we are fighting a two-front Cold War, in a sense, or two-front and one combined enemy. The more we do, we're driving Russia and China closer together. And this policy that's been articulated, especially by Pompeo, but by Trump, of course, by Bolton and Bannon and all of them, the anti-China policy, which is, again, a bipartisan policy. You mentioned how much the Biden people are. Well, it was the Biden-Obama administration. It was November 2011 when Hillary Clinton wrote her article in Foreign Policy magazine titled America's Pacific Century, and talked explicitly about repositioning America's troops from Europe to Asia to confront China. And, and on the other hand, then you've got Chinese pride and Chinese obstinance, and China is saying it's suffered a century of humiliation and they're not going to allow this to happen again. And militarily, the Chinese have been strengthening and building up in that region. And there's no guarantee that the United States, short of an all-out nuclear war, can defeat China militarily in the Pacific at this point. But the United States still keeps sending these freedom of navigation operations, which are very provocative, into the South China Sea. It still encourages the Japanese in the East China Sea. So one of these things could blow up very, very easily and quickly get out of control.
Peter, I do want to transition to a second part here to talk about the new screenplay that you've been working on about Henry Wallace. But before we move on to that, and then also Bernie Sanders dropping out, but before we move on to that, maybe we can kind of wrap up the discussion here. Can we maybe go back a little bit to World War II? And I have a kind of more general question. That is, we talked about the position of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Nazi Germany and the non-aggression pact. And I think the non-aggression pact is really used as the main historic piece of evidence, quote unquote, as part of this narrative that Max was trying to unpack, this narrative of double genocide. using the totalitarian thesis that this ridiculous idea that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy were all the same thing in their respective historical conditions, and then using the non-aggression pact, misportraying it as an alliance, and then saying that Hitler and Stalin were basically the same guy who were allied together. But what's not mentioned ever in that history is the Munich Agreement that was signed before the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact, where in the Munich Agreement, the UK and France essentially just gave up Czechoslovakia to the Nazis to colonize the Sudetenland without even the input of the Czech government that existed at the time. And then there were also non-aggression pacts that were signed between Poland and Nazi Germany in 1934, very early in the rise of Nazi Germany. There were non-aggression pacts between Estonia, Latvia, and Germany, and several other countries. And this isn't even to mention the position of Chamberlain in the UK, who was, you could say at best that he was kind of an apologist for fascism, if not somewhat sympathetic. And then, of course, the elements of the British royal family. I mean, there were strong elements of the British royal family who were openly pro-Nazi. So, I mean, there's a lot to respond to there. But before we move away from that World War II history, can you respond to this idea that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was an alliance between two countries that were supposedly allies, and then carried out what's known as double genocide now, which is official government policy now in numerous right-wing governments in Eastern Europe today. Their official government line is that the Soviets and the Nazis were equally bad. They both carried out genocide. And if you are a historian who denies that, in some cases, people have ended up in jail.
And here it's advanced by prominent liberal historians like Timothy Snyder and so many in a sort of soft, warmed over form.
Well, it's important to recognize what a monster Stalin was, and how his monstrous policies weakened the Soviet Union on the cusp of World War II. Oliver and I got attacked a lot in Untold History because we didn't push the narrative that Ben and Max are both talking about now. This equivalence of evil in the world, which is not to say that we were very open in our criticism of Stalin, and we think it's essential to make that very, very clear. Stalin was brutal and repressive, and none of us would ever want to live in Stalinist Soviet Union. And Stalin, to me, if there was any hope for the Russian Revolution, now Marx had argued that the revolution should not take place in Russia because Russia was too culturally and economically backward for a socialist revolution to succeed. Well, the Soviets proved him right, unfortunately. But Stalin was, in some ways, added a level of repression that goes far beyond what a Lenin or a Trotsky could have envisioned. That said, there is no equivalence between the two sides, and there is no equivalence of what their goals were for the world. In fact, Stalin did not have a plan for world conquest. If anything, Trotsky did. And with the defeat of Trotsky, this vision of a world communist revolution ended. Stalin's idea was socialism in one country. He was much more defensive. Even at the end of World War II, there could have been, the Communist Party was enormously powerful in France, in Italy, in Greece, and other places. Stalin really wanted to spread world communism, whatever form the Soviets had. He could have done so much, much more aggressively. But what happens with the Hitler-Stalin pact is that Stalin decides he's got to buy time because he knows that the Germans are coming after him. And so was it the right thing to do? No. Was it understandable? Yes, given the broader context that we've been talking about the West's effectively giving Hitler an open door to go after Germany. Now, with all the terrible things that one could say about Stalin, and there's murder of the officer corps, there's purging of the officer corps, that really set the Soviet army back. His policies in Ukraine and other parts were self-destructive. But that said, Averell Harriman, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union and one of the leading proponents of the new Cold War strategy in 1946, and comes here and he's pushing Truman to really have a hard line against the Soviet Union. Harriman, who knew Stalin better than anybody and worked more closely with him, says Stalin, the war leader, was popular, and there can be no doubt that he was the one who held the Soviet Union together. I do not think anyone else could have done it. I'd like to emphasize my great admiration for Stalin, the national leader, in an emergency. One of those historic occasions when one man made such a difference. He had an enormous ability to absorb detail and to act on detail. He was very much alert to the needs of the whole war machine. These were not the characteristics of a bureaucrat, but rather those of an extremely able and vigorous war leader. We wanted to demean Stalin, and his policies, even during the war, were in many ways brutal. I mean, he had a cavalier attitude toward life. As he once said, the death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 1 million people is a statistic. And he would throw these Russian soldiers into the battle, basically as cannon fodder. And the estimates are that at least 500,000 more Russian soldiers than were necessary died as a result of the kind of policies that Stalin advocated. But Harriman and historians who are knowledgeable give him a lot of the credit for the victory. And we know that the Soviets deserve the lion's share of the credit overall. So we have to look at Stalin, again, in a much more fairer, more complex and nuanced historical context, and how Stalin is a war leader. And now when I take my students to Moscow now for Victory Day, I'm somewhat stunned by the Stalin resuscitation that's going on there. And according to the latest poll that I saw, 51% of Russian people now have a positive view of Stalin. 51%. And that to me is very troubling. It's one thing to say that Stalin was in some ways a heroic war leader who symbolizes to the Russians the victory over fascism. But to view him in his broader entirety as a positive figure is much more troubling. And there are a lot of things that I'm critical about Putin and Russia from a democratic standpoint or a progressive standpoint. It's a very conservative country still. It's a country that extols religiosity. That tends to be very nationalistic. They don't do the damage in the world that the US does, but there's a lot of ways in which I would like to see Putin play a much more positive role in the world. But I worry that this kind of celebration of World War II in some ways turns into an uncritical celebration of everything about World War II, where we have to be somewhat more selective in what we do praise about World War II and the victory over fascism, especially now at a time when Putin is not nearly as critical of some of the neo-fascist elements rising up in Eastern Europe or in Central Europe as I would like him to be. And to me, that's very upsetting that somebody who's so fiercely anti-fascist in World War II, in a country that deserves the credit for having defeated fascism, does not play the same role in opposition to the neo-Nazi right-wing movements that are cropping up across much of Europe today.
what do you think could be said that or done that isn't being done? I follow this fairly closely for someone who isn't a specialist on Eastern Europe. And, in the US, we get fed a lot in mainstream media to convince us that actually Putin or Russian intelligence is actually the main force, covertly or semi-covertly, or through its sort of propaganda mechanism supporting neo-Nazism and neo-fascism in Eastern Europe, when it appears to me that the incipient forces in Eastern Europe of neo-fascism are anti-Russian. But what do you think Putin is not doing here, or where is his administration being unproductive in the fight against fascism across Europe?
Well, and I'll add really quickly, not just the incipient forces, but the ruling governments in numerous countries, the Baltic states, which are members of NATO, and have erected numerous monuments at this point to Nazi collaborators. They have far-right governments. The government in Poland, which is very right-wing and has engaged in Holocaust revisionism. Excluding Hungary, many of the governments in Eastern Europe, I definitely agree that it's absolutely true that Russia today has a right-wing nationalism that is sympathetic to right-wing nationalism movements, especially in Western Europe. But if you look in Eastern Europe...
Or in Hungary.
Yeah, in Hungary. But if you look in Eastern Europe, I do agree with Max. It's pretty objectively true that the majority of the far-right fascistic nationalist movements in especially NATO countries are actually very viciously anti-Russian and pro-NATO. And NATO even published a video honoring the Forest brothers, who were Baltic Nazi collaborators. And that's officially coming from NATO's official propaganda arm.
Yes, but we expect NATO to be doing this. This is not a surprise that NATO would be opportunistic in that way in terms of extolling these kinds of right-wing forces, because they really, as you're saying, undergird this expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe and the sending of these new brigades and the asking for more and more NATO forces in those countries. I just held Russia to a higher standard at this point when it comes to questions of anti-fascism than I hold the United States or NATO to. And so I want to see Russia, given its pride in its defeat of fascism in World War II, I want to see Russia play a leading role in denouncing fascism everywhere now. And I don't see that. And I see ties with certain politicians in France or
National Front.
Yeah. Russia is willing to accept allies where it can find them now. And the whole global atmosphere is corrosive to the point where the lesson of World War II should be that the United States and Russia and China should be working together to defeat the pandemics, to end the nuclear arms race, to work together to end the wars in various parts of the world, to work together if we're going against certain kinds of international terrorism, to work together to defeat these right-wing forces, fascistic forces in Europe, to end this planetary militarism, to deal together with climate change. That should be the lesson that comes out of World War II. I was supposed to go to Germany a few weeks ago for the meeting at the Elbe River of American and Soviet troops there. It was going to be first conference in Berlin, then we were going to go to the Elbe River, and it was going to, again, emphasize those positive things that came out of the wartime alliance. That same alliance should be rebuilt in whatever way we can rebuild it now. And but instead what we've got is make America great again and make Russia great again and make China great again. And these very, very corrosive and destructive narratives.
But yeah, that's a really good place to end. I actually found some footage, or someone sent me this footage, and if you're just listening on SoundCloud or iTunes or whatever, I guess you can't really watch the footage, but it shows U.S. troops and members of the Red Army together, just hanging out and taking pictures together and exchanging cigarettes.
Doing a lot of drinking together,
doing a lot of drinking, probably pounding some vodka shots. I don't know. You didn't have like U.S. frat boys then who could have introduced the Soviet soldiers to Jaeger bombs and whatnot. No. But this footage, I don't know. It just sort of stirs a lot of imagination. It stirred a lot of imagination. It made me think, how much better the world could have been had there not been the Cold War that I was raised in, and the new Cold War that I'll be probably spending the rest of my life in and the rest of our lives in. And it's a real man-made, empire-made tragedy. So I thought maybe we could close with this footage.
And when we talk about Bernie Sanders another time, we can talk about the end of World War II. We didn't even get to mention Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we're really just talking about World War II in Europe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, for the audience, I would highly recommend. Yeah, we're going to do a part 2, but for the audience, I would also, again, plug the Untold History of the United States, and specifically the part on this issue, because Peter Kuznick is one of the world's leading experts on U.S. nuclear policy and the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he shows in that book and in the documentary series how even the U.S. government itself admitted that the nuclear bombing of Japan was totally unnecessary to end the war effort and a horrific crime against humanity.
We'll definitely be back with for a part 2 with Peter. All right,
we'll do that.
Thanks a lot for joining us. I learned a lot.